Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Aaron Woodrick, the Director of Domestic Policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa, and I want to welcome you all to the Canadian book launch event for Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19 by Alina Chan and Matt Ridley. I'm very thrilled to have both authors joining us today for a discussion about this very fascinating book. But before we get to that, of course, I want to introduce our authors. Dr. Alina Chan is a postdoctoral researcher at the Broad Institute at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Harvard with a background in medical genetics, synthetic biology, and vector engineering. During the pandemic, Dr. Chan began to investigate problems relevant to finding the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and in parallel spearheaded the development of the COVID-19 CoV genetics browser, helping scientists around the world rapidly track virus lineages and mutations by locations and date ranges of interest. So welcome, Alina. And Matt Ridley is a member of the House of Lords of the United Kingdom and the author of several books that together have sold well over 1 million copies in 32 languages, including my favorites, The Rational Optimist and How Innovation Works. During the current pandemic, he has written essays for the Wall Street Journal and The Spectator about the origin and genomics of the virus. So Alina, Matt, thank you both so very much for joining us today. I guess we'll start, Matt, maybe with a very simple question. Why did you write this book?
There is no more important topic at the moment than where this virus came from. It's killed millions, turned over the lives of hundreds of millions. 2 years in, we still don't know how it happened. I got more and more curious about this. Alina was doing extraordinary work trying to understand this and turning over important information. I approached her and said, I think this deserves a book-length treatment. You can't go into all the aspects of this story in one article or one film. You've got to go at book length. And so we decided very rashly to join forces and try and write something that wasn't going to be overtaken by events entirely. And we thought while we were writing it, maybe the answer will suddenly become clear before we finish the book and our book will no longer be necessary. But we got to the end. We still don't know where it came from, but we've got some fascinating stories to tell about what might be the answer.
And, on the topic of deciding to write the book, now, did you reach out to Alina? Because I understand you had not actually met until very recently. You wrote this book without actually having met. Is that right?
That's correct. I first got in touch with Alina in May of 2020. I proposed the book to her in the fall of 2020. We began writing at the turn of the year. We finished it in September with the last edits and last minute changes. The book was printed in beginning of November, and then we met for the first time when I was visiting Boston, and it was very moving. It's great. She turns out to be three-dimensional.
Yes, I guess a lot of people are discovering three-dimensionality now that restrictions have been lifted in a lot of places. Maybe Alina, we could talk about. Obviously, the book is about the origins of the virus. I think it's fair to say that early on, the idea that there was a lab leak, the idea that this was not of natural origin, was really sort of dismissed as a conspiracy theory. That's changed over time. So what do you say to people who still insist that there's no basis whatsoever to even consider that this might have come out of a lab?
I've been pretty surprised to continue encountering people who think that a lab origin is still a conspiracy theory, because right now, even the US intelligence community has said that a lab origin is a plausible origin of COVID-19. Even top scientists, even virologists who directly work with SARS-like viruses said that we can't tell whether this virus came from a lab or not. Even the top news media like the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, their journalists have written that we need to investigate a lab origin. So it surprises me that people today, there are still a few people who say that saying this might have come from a lab is misinformation. And if you look at all of the available evidence, there is a wall of circumstantial evidence for both origins, natural or from a lab. And the fact remains that there's no dispositive evidence. So there's no definitive evidence, no smoking gun pointing to either one. But we do know that the natural wildlife trade origin has been investigated to some extent. So the Chinese scientists who have been sampling 80,000 animal samples have told us that they have found no trace of SARS-2-like viruses till today, despite covering thousands of animal samples across the wildlife trade from 2017 to today. The only SARS-2-like viruses found have been limited to only 3 pangolin coronaviruses, and yet we know that there were no pangolins sold in Wuhan markets leading up to the pandemic.
Okay, and I think it's worth saying here that this book, having read it, it's really not about the conclusion so much as it's about how you reach the conclusion, which is that either of these possibilities are equally plausible. The you sort of go through the history of what came to light, what we know, what we don't know, and you don't have a sort of, like you say, smoking gun at the end where you land on a conclusion, but you do say, look, we need to treat both of these possibilities seriously. And with that in mind, Matt, how would in your view, how has the discussion around the origin of the virus changed since the beginning of the pandemic? And what impact are you hoping that this book will have on that debate?
Yeah, you're right that we don't come to a conclusion, but we do lean towards the lab leak being slightly more likely at this stage. And that is not where either of us started. We both began thinking that it was probably a natural spillover event, and gradually, as the evidence has accumulated in favor of a lab leak and against a wildlife market event, we've come to the conclusion that is slightly more probable. The debate on as a whole has gone from the most extraordinary one-sided nature early in the pandemic, when we were told by senior virologists that any idea of a laboratory origin for this virus could be ruled out, and any discussion to the contrary was a conspiracy theory. I actually believed that. I thought they must know what they're talking about. I read some of their papers. I didn't entirely follow the arguments at that stage, but I began to look into it, and I gradually realized those arguments didn't quite add up. But 18 months went by, during which the mainstream media and organizations like Facebook simply didn't allow discussion of the possibility that this was a laboratory leak. And then something changed around May of this year. The farce of the World Health Organization visit to Wuhan and the endorsement of the Chinese authorities' theory that this had reached Wuhan from elsewhere on frozen food, a highly implausible suggestion, and that was more likely than a laboratory leak, led to a significant backlash, I think. And then there was a letter published in Science by a group of senior scientists, partly orchestrated by Alina, saying, look, I'm sorry, we do have to take this possibility seriously. And within a few weeks, a lot of the mainstream media changed their tune and said, yes, I know we labeled this as a conspiracy theory and that it could be crackpot and ruled out. We now admit that wasn't quite right. So there's been a very big change in the way this is discussed in the West, but still a lot of mainstream media, a lot of mainstream scientists are certain in their own minds that they can rule out a laboratory leak. We have no such certainty.
Okay. There's quite a bit of science in the book for non-science, or I guess social scientists like myself. It can be challenging to learn some of the terminology, but one that's very, very important in this book, Lena, is what you talk about, which is called gain of function, which is something that is new in virus experimentation. Could you sort of explain what gain of function is and why it's a notable part of this story?
Yes, it's, as you said, surprising that this phrase gain of function has suddenly become just widespread. Like everybody has heard it by this point, gain of function research. So what is it exactly? I'd say that when people use the phrase gain of function, they typically are talking about a type of research where you have increased the transmissibility or the severity of disease caused by a pathogen. These types of research are being conducted by some handful of scientists who believe that by creating these pathogens, these dangerous pathogens, you can predict how wild natural viruses can evolve to spill over and cause pandemics. So there's a well-intentioned behind that, but at the same time, there are a large number of scientists who say that this type of work is extremely dangerous. So when you weigh the risk versus benefits, the risk of creating dangerous pathogens in the lab is that they could leak and actually cause a pandemic, whereas the benefits are really unclear. Even till today, it's unclear what any gain of function research has actually produced in terms of making vaccines. No. In terms of making therapeutics, very little. So really what we need to invest in is pandemic prevention technology, so surveillance, diagnostics, vaccine, therapeutics R&D platforms. But these types of research where you're enhancing pathogens to predict what might happen in the future have not paid off, in my opinion. There's no evidence to support this. And so it is really problematic that this type of research is still ongoing. So just 8 days ago, the US CDC put up a notice saying that anyone who's making chimera with SARS-1 and SARS-2 should tell them and let them know in 90 days if they insist on experimenting with these. So why are scientists making chimera with SARS-1 and SARS-2? Why are they putting two dangerous pathogens together? And why is there so little transparency? So I'd say that the public, and I hope people reading our book, will come away with this, if anything, a greater sense of a need to push for more transparency on this type of research.
But just to see if I understand correctly, so gain of function essentially is the idea of you sort of have to create the monster to learn how to fight it. But there's obviously great risk when you do that. And you're saying it's not clear what the benefit is of creating these monsters. There hasn't been any sort of benefit to the scientific community by doing this. And all you really do when you perform gain of function experimentation is you increase the risk because of the possibility of a virus leak. Is that?
Yes, because there's no way to predict what novel virus will appear. There's like trillions of viruses out there. So not all of them infect humans, obviously, but there's so much diversity that's not sampled. There's no way for you to tell what the next pandemic is going to be. Yes, lots of people say there's going to be a future pandemic. We all know that. But how can you possibly tell what virus or bacteria might even cause this?
Right. And this is new? The idea of gain of function experimentation is not something that has happened. This is a relatively new development, and that's what makes it so controversial?
Actually, it has been around for a while, so more than a decade, actually. And I think that the conflict or the controversy really peaked in 2011 when two teams of scientists, so one based in Europe and one based in US/Asia, did experiments to make a bird flu influenza virus transmissible through the air amongst mammals. So they did this in the lab by passing it through ferrets, an animal model for humans. And they found that, yes, within a few mutations, they could make this virus spread through the air effectively between the ferrets. Previously, it could not do this. Previously, it was mainly, even if it's spilled from bird to human, that human would not pass it to another human easily.
Oh, well, I hope they close the door on that lab, but that's sort of really that's the concern, isn't it? And, Matt, maybe I'll put this to you. In the book, you canvass the history of lab leaks of viruses, and it was surprising to me that there was enough to sort of fill a chapter on this. Just how often and how common is it to have viruses escape from labs?
Right. This is a very important topic, and one that I think there is public misunderstanding on. People think, well, it can't happen very often. It must be an extremely rare event. Of course, they're very careful in these labs, but and it's true, they are very careful, but there are so many labs in the world that it is inevitable that accidents will happen. And we've seen over the years, deaths caused by anthrax and brucellosis and foot and mouth disease and smallpox and Marburg virus out of laboratories. And in the case of SARS, the first SARS virus, that escaped from laboratories 4 times, twice in Beijing, once in Taiwan, once in Singapore, at least. There may have been 2 other occasions in Beijing as well, as far as we can make out. And on each of those occasions, on 3 of those occasions, nobody knew exactly how it had happened. That is to say, a researcher got infected working in a laboratory on SARS, with SARS, and that was diagnosed. And in one of the Beijing cases, 1 person died and 11 were sick. But no, there wasn't a dropped flask or a broken glass or something like that. Now, where do these accidents happen? Mostly they happen in relatively low biosecurity laboratories, but that's not even necessarily the case. One of the Taiwan case was in a BSL-4 lab, the highest security. The research that's been done in Wuhan on these kind of viruses was being mostly done on bat-derived viruses at biosecurity level 2. Now, that's not much more than wearing gloves or goggles and a mask, perhaps. Whereas biosecurity level 3, which is where they did some of the experiments with humanized mice, is inside sealed cabinets at least. But if a virus as infectious as SARS-CoV-2 was in a biosecurity level 2 lab in a sample, then it's almost inevitable that one of the researchers or one of the other people in the lab would have picked it up. It's such an infectious virus that you could not contain it at that kind of security level.
Wow, it was very eyebrow raising to see you sort of account for how frequent lab leaks are, because you would think these are very serious things, as you say, there's security, but it happens a lot more than I think a lot of people would appreciate. But I mean, maybe coming back to the idea that the lab leak theory is not plausible. I've heard some people maybe they accept it's not a conspiracy theory, but that you're placing too much weight on it for the simple reason that it's impossible to disprove. How are we ever supposed to disprove the idea that it comes from the lab leak? And are you essentially saying it's more likely without offering people a way to sort of rebut your argument, because it's just not possible to prove that it didn't come out of the lab?
Well, I don't agree. I think there is a lot of information pointing towards the fact that it is no coincidence that this pandemic began in the city with the biggest research program on bat-borne SARS-like coronaviruses in the world by a mile, and in a city where there were researchers who were traveling 1,000 miles to a different region to collect viruses because they're not found locally to the city, bringing them back to the lab, experimenting on them in that laboratory. That is a pretty big coincidence, if it is a coincidence. But is it impossible to disprove that? No. All they have to do to disprove that is open their files and show us exactly which samples of which viruses they were dealing with in the laboratory, all of their sequences, all of their histories, where they came from, what experiments were done with them, and open up their books. Because at the moment, they haven't done that. There is a database with 22,000 entries in it, 15,000 of which are derived from bats. They're samples and sequences of mostly viruses, and that database was being accessed and updated until the 12th of September 2019. Since when it has been inaccessible and unavailable. And the excuse that they give in the Wuhan Institute of Virology for not sharing this database with the world is that there were attempts to hack it, which is A, pretty unlikely before the pandemic began, and B, doesn't really make sense anyway, because so what? If people are trying to hack it, then share it with someone else so that we can see what's in it. The purpose of that database, remember, was to predict and prevent the next pandemic. It was to build up a library of threats so that we could understand where the next pandemic might come from. As Alina has put it, which pandemic are they waiting for before they share this information with the world?
Yeah. Did this one not meet the bar of something serious enough where they'd actually have to be transparent? Although, as most people would observe, the government of China is not known for its affinity for transparency. So perhaps this is not out of character for them. But speaking of a lack of transparency, I'm just curious, in the course of your research, because of course we are a Canadian think tank and we like to have a Canadian angle at most of our talks. There has been a bit of a story here in Canada regarding Canada's National Microbiology Lab, which is based in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And there was a controversy there surrounding the dismissal of 2 Chinese scientists who worked at that lab after they'd exported some shipments of an Ebola virus to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, of all places. Now, there's no evidence that this particular story is linked to COVID-19. But nonetheless, the Canadian government has gone to great lengths to refuse disclosure of any documents that would shed light on what had gone on there. They first claimed it was a privacy issue. Then they claimed it was a national security issue. Parliament demanded the documents. They would not. The Public Health Agency refused to hand them over. I guess maybe, Alina, I'm curious to see your thoughts on this lack of transparency, especially in this case. It's coming from a democratic government as opposed to an authoritarian one.
Yeah, so I have been following this story in the past 2 years because it's full of mystery, right? Like why are there all these hundreds of pages of information we're not allowed to see, and then we're hearing that dangerous pathogens, Ebola and Nipah viruses, are being sent from Canada to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which we know has links to the military in China and is doing some fairly controversial experiments, I'd say, with pathogens. So when I've read the news covering this story of the Winnipeg lab, the NML, they always, eager to say this has nothing to do with COVID-19. They're always saying this, no coronaviruses were sent. But the problem is, what happens if next year an Ebola outbreak happens in Wuhan? Then there will be a link. So like, the question is, it's not whether it caused this pandemic. The question is, what is happening here? Why are, is intellectual property being shared alongside viruses? Can we find out why are we hearing flip-flopping on details? First it was about privacy concerns that we couldn't see these documents, and now it's about national security. So when the public is faced with a story this conflicted, they can easily jump to more extreme scenarios in their mind, like a cover-up which might relate to incompetence suddenly gets seen as a cover-up of malicious intent, of like bioweaponry. So my hope is that the people who are in charge of this case can rethink their strategy. Just if you're transparent with this, then the public will see that maybe that's not such a big deal. There's no like very dangerous bioweapon work happening. But if you're not transparent, then that's where the rumors and the fears grow.
Yeah, and certainly given what you've both outlined in the book about the way accidents happen and mistakes happen, and they can't identify why in some cases, it would certainly be helpful if you're able to identify these things, because you might be able to at least put in place protocols to prevent them in the future.
Aaron, just adding on that point, I don't know a great deal about the Canadian story, but in the case of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, it was collaborating with a Western organization based in the US called the EcoHealth Alliance, which was directing US government funds to it. And those funds were to support the collection of these viruses and the assembly of them into databases. Now, if the US taxpayer has paid for some of that data, the US taxpayer should have a right to see that data. But at the moment, it appears that a contract was signed with the Wuhan Institute of Virology saying that no, the data belongs to the Chinese. In the case of other countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, the EcoHealth Alliance was working in those countries to collect bats and sample their viruses. And they specifically said to the US government, by the way, when we find viruses, to make life easier, we're not going to get them analyzed locally. We're going to send them to a partner that we trust and know, and that is the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. So it appears that there may even be sequences and data about novel bat-borne coronaviruses in Wuhan that didn't even begin life in China and weren't even collected by Chinese scientists, but were collected by American scientists in other countries. So there's something going wrong here in terms of the sharing between different countries of information that is being gathered before the pandemic begins even.
It's fascinating stuff, and it's something I'm sure most people have no appreciation of. I want to pause here for just a second because we do actually have some copies of your book to give away to viewers who are interested. So what we're going to do is we have a URL that we're going to post in the chat on YouTube, and I think share on Facebook for those of you watching there as well. So if you click on that URL, it'll take you to a forum. Fortunately, it's a Canadian audience that we're aiming for here, so you do have to be based in Canada to receive a book. But again, if you're interested, we have some copies to give away. I think 20 or 25 at least. So please click on that URL, and it'll take you to a form to fill out, and we can get you either a hard copy or an ebook copy. I think maybe here we could just talk a little bit about what happens next. What do we hope to see those in positions of power? What should they do about it now? How can China, I guess, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, how can they be held account for the lack of transparency, if nothing else?
Shall I go first on that? It's rather than blaming, we're trying to learn lessons here. That's an important point. And just as when there's an airline accident, the world has got into the habit of saying, let's make sure we can all share any lessons that are learned. So in this case, the world must be able to learn all the lessons that we can from this incident, whether it was from a laboratory or whether it was from a wildlife market. And that's partly why it's so important to find out which, so that we know what to do next. I think that what needs to happen is that the West needs to come together and draw up a pandemic treaty of some kind that it can all agree to, which, while not completely invading the secrecy of its own biodefense programs, etc., there does have to be some national security issues here. While not doing that, there is an agreement to share data relevant to potential pandemic pathogens, and particularly to be fully transparent in the wake of an event, so that if there's an outbreak in a Western country, everybody gets to know about it through the World Health Organization or directly. And the more countries that can sign this treaty and agree to these practices, the more pressure will come on those countries that won't sign such a treaty. It's sort of the way the International Atomic Energy deals with nuclear proliferation. It's above my pay grade in geopolitical terms, but I think that's sort of the direction we should be heading in.
Okay. Alina, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, so aside from international policies, I think that there have to be local policies too, things to do with research locally. Scientists, scientific communities need to change the way that we report science and the way that we do science. So yes, we need a pandemic treaty. We need to investigate to set a precedent so that in the future people know that they will be investigated, not just let off the hook and hiding information. But scientists and journalists in each country also need to have some introspection and see how flaws in their reporting system, in the news reporting system, have been exploited to cover up an entire plausible scientific hypothesis for close to 2 years. So even till today, there has been no proper investigation of the lab origin hypothesis.
Matt, you mentioned briefly the World Health Organization, obviously an organization that's been very prominent during the pandemic. What role do they play in this aspect of the like the origin of the virus? Would you say that they have their comments have sort of set the public tone in terms of what the origin is? Were they the ones that initially poured cold water on the lab leak theory? What has the WHO's role been in all of this?
Well, the WHO early in the pandemic was very much repeating the Chinese authorities' reassurances that this virus couldn't be spread human to human, and in other ways was not particularly alert or quick to respond. It was ignoring, for example, Taiwanese warnings that this was a person-to-person spread that was happening quite rapidly in Wuhan, because under Chinese influence, the World Health Organization doesn't really recognize the existence of Taiwan as a separate country. And then the World Health Organization set out to investigate the origin of COVID-19 in collaboration with China. It took 6 months or more to negotiate the terms of that investigation. And then when the investigation finally began in January of this year, a year after the pandemic had begun, it was a bit of a farce, frankly. A bunch of Western scientists came to Wuhan to join their Chinese colleagues. The only American on the team had a huge conflict of interest as a very close collaborator with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and had been saying for months, this is Peter Daszak, that any idea that it could came from a laboratory was nonsense. So he'd made up his mind before he got there. And when in Wuhan, they spent basically 10 days or so visiting a few sites in a rather desultory way under the direction of their Chinese hosts. They spent a morning at a museum dedicated to celebrating the defeat of COVID-19 by the city of Wuhan. Not a good use of their time. And then at the end of this, they gave a press conference in which they endorsed this ludicrous suggestion from Chinese scientists that the virus had come to Wuhan on frozen food, magically failing to infect anyone in the source country or the source farm or along the way or in any other city with markets, etc., etc. And then magically managing to disappear when the animals in the market, the frozen animals in the market, were tested in January 2020. So that, I think, was a very poor chapter in the history of the World Health Organization. And I think what's really serious about it is that for most of 2020, if you asked a Western government, as I asked the British government, what are we doing to look into the origin of this virus? I would get told, we're leaving it up to the World Health Organization. So the very fact that everyone saw it as the WHO's job, and the WHO, A, dragged its feet, took a long time about it, and C, did a very poor job when it did it, meant that the world missed a chance to, while the trail was warm, to find out more about what went on. And remember, Australia called for an independent inquiry quite early in the pandemic and was punished with trade sanctions by China for doing that, just for calling for an independent investigation. And Australia's allies didn't do a lot to back them up on that. So frankly, my respect for the World Health Organization has plummeted during the last 2 years.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that and address some of these questions in the chat that's related to. So the question is, how much did the delayed response to COVID-19 make the virus impossible to contain? So imagine if we had a pandemic treaty where each country, on the day day zero, they hear about this novel outbreak, they could appoint someone, a new investigator, to go in and find out what's happening on the ground at wherever a market or a lab is. They would find out whether it's human to human transmissible. They would find out how many samples were, who were early cases. They would find out when had this started in that city. They would find out the genome of the virus so that they could immediately start creating diagnostics, vaccines. So we know that the Chinese government even had the genome sequence of the virus as early as 27 December, but the rest of the world only got it 2 weeks later. So we had a 2-week lag in terms of being able to start making vaccines and diagnostics. So that cannot happen again. Like this pandemic, I think it could have been contained if we had heard everything as it happened in real time rather than with a lag of weeks.
I'm picking up on the idea of not sharing information, which of course is a big theme in this whole story. Alina, in the book, you sort of go through some sleuthing in terms of how you uncover things published in journals, things that were sort of curiously forgotten or not released or released at strange times. Can you sort of summarize? And I am assuming part of this was part of the reason that you eventually sort of leaned towards the lab leak theories, because what you found in all of that documentation is that there is actually work being done in Wuhan and some viruses they were working with that have not obviously an exact resemblance to COVID-19, but have a degree of overlap with that virus. So what was it that you discovered that sort of tipped the scales for you?
So a lot of new information has trickled out over the last almost 2 years. So we slowly found out, and I'm going to sum it all up here, that when SARS-CoV-2 was detected in Wuhan in December 2019, the local Wuhan Institute of Virology had been working with 9 of the closest relatives to this virus, all collected from a mine in Yunnan, South China, where 6 miners had suffered from a mysterious pneumonia suspected to be caused by a SARS-like virus, and half of them died. So imagine getting that news on day one, that the closest relatives to this virus are from a mine where half the people infected with SARS-like illness died. I mean, the whole world will have reacted differently. They've been like, okay, then let's take this seriously. Like, this is not less than the flu. This is not like, a hoax or something. So, and we've only just recently, in the last 2 months, heard that lab in the WIV had a roadmap with collaborators in the US to insert novel genetic modifications into novel SARS-like viruses in their possession. So there is a reservoir of information about the type of work they were doing, and it's actually here in the United States, in New York. So it's kind of mind-blowing that this information has to be pulled out of them, like extracted through litigation, through the Freedom of Information Act, or through leaks. And it's like this pandemic is of such a huge scale. It's affected hundreds of millions of people, killed millions of people. Like what more extraordinary situation are we waiting for before we can get transparency?
And can I just add to that the information that we have in the book, not much of it was uncovered by the mainstream media, with some very honourable exceptions. Journalists didn't do a lot of investigative reporting on this topic. Likewise, politicians, senior scientists, even intelligence agents, on the whole, didn't really cover themselves in glory in investigating this topic, in our view. The people who did do a good job were amateurs, were open source analysts, some of them scientists, some of them not, but people who knew how to search the internet to find obscure documents, theses, entries into genetic databases, grant proposals, things like that, and find them in China or elsewhere, uncover them, and show them to the world. So, for example, the link with that mine shaft that Alina mentioned was obscured, was not given in the scientific paper by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They even changed the name of the virus that had come from that mine shaft. And that put us off the scent for a couple of months. And then, thanks to a young man in India called the Seeker, we were able to find out exactly what happened to those 6 miners who were shoveling bat guano and fell sick, and 3 of them died, and exactly how many visits to that mine shaft the Wuhan Institute of Virology made in order to try to find the source of this illness, and what they did with those viruses that they collected. And then, thanks to a Spaniard called Francisco de Ribera, we were able to find out exactly where they'd collected each of the viruses they had collected, and find out the pattern of their visits and what they'd done with them, and which ones they'd managed to grow in the laboratory, etc. Except that neither of these sources or any of the others have been able to identify the viruses that they collected after 2016. So we've now got pretty good data on exactly what they did up to 2016, but it's a bit of a blank after that. And so, that's clearly something we need to know.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking in terms of the, assuming for a moment that this did escape from a lab, is there anything that you, in the course of your research, would lead you to conclude that it was essentially a virus of natural origin that was taken to the lab and escaped, or it was a virus of natural origin which was taken to the lab and tinkered with in some way and then escaped? Are you able to weigh in on that at all, or are you simply saying that based on what you know, it could have escaped from a lab, but you don't really weigh in on whether or not what escaped from the lab was essentially toyed with by people at the Institute?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that question. So even the top virologists, even people who worked with the Wuhan Institute of Virology lab, have told the media in multiple interviews that you can't tell from the sequence alone. Without access to the database of sequences that the WIV had, there's no way to know how they would have designed genetic modifications or what their starting material was. So you can't predict it without knowing what they had at their disposal. So one very famous virologist, a Nobel Prize laureate, even said it's a question of history. So it has to be treated not just as a scientific question, but like an investigative question. So like, what did they do, and can we piece it together? And a lot of that can be found from the Equal Health Alliance. So it's not a dead end. Like, I don't agree with people who say there's no way to tell. There is a way to tell.
The information is there, it just is not public.
Hasn't been obtained.
Yeah, I think in direct answer to your question, we both probably lean towards the idea that this was still a natural virus, that it just happened to have been collected in the laboratory, perhaps, and then leaked out through an incident. But I think the information that came out in end of August, beginning of September, which Alina referred to earlier, about exactly what modifications the EcoHealth Alliance was planning to do with the Wuhan Institute of Virology as a collaborator, to novel coronaviruses, to essentially make them easier to grow in human cells in the laboratory so as to be able to study them better. That information certainly had a big influence on me, and I think on Alina, into thinking that the virus may well have been engineered before it was released. we've got the odd feature that all SARS-like viruses collected from the wild, including all relatives of SARS-CoV-2 that have ever been seen in bats or any other species, lack an insertion of about 12 base pairs, 12 letters of text, at a particular point in the spike gene, which is called a furin cleavage site, and which gives SARS-CoV-2 its particular infectiousness, is therefore one of the main reasons we're having a pandemic and not a local outbreak. So where that 12 base pair insertion came from is a big question. And yes, it could have appeared naturally, but it is relevant to discover that putting a cleavage site insertion into a virus was one of the plans mooted in 2018 by the scientists in Wuhan, along with their collaborators in the US.
I'd phrase it this way. It's like finding from early 2018, they had a proposal saying that they were putting horns on the heads of horses. And at the end of 2019, a unicorn shows up. So yes, it could be that they found a very rare unicorn that no one has ever seen before. And despite searching all the horses in the world, they cannot find another unicorn. Or it could be that this lab might have followed through on their proposal and made a unicorn. So, I mean, for me, it's like, what are the odds? It's just, we have to investigate. So I'm not saying we know, but I'm saying there's a huge need to investigate this.
And in the book, you make this clear. I want to emphasize this point. This is a very unique feature for this virus, right? This is not something that's just rare. It would literally be the only example for this type of virus that has this particular feature.
Yes, exactly. So people could make the analogy that other four-legged creatures have horns, like, antlers. But this, within the whole family of SARS viruses, there's no other that has a furin cleavage site insertion in the spike like this that creates this feature. So it's a mystery. And top virologists have also said there's no way to tell. Even top virologists who have put this feature artificially into the spike of SARS-1 have said that they can't tell whether this feature in SARS-2 is artificial or natural. They have described it as highly unusual. Some even said it might be a smoking gun for an artificial origin. This is coming from top virologists.
Okay. Matt, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, Alina's quite right that there are other coronaviruses and indeed other viruses that have furin cleavage sites. So it's not completely absurd to think that there might have been a rare variant of this out there. If a virus in a market had a furin cleavage site in it, then it's much more likely to start a pandemic. Likewise, if a virus in a lab had a furin cleavage site, it's much more likely to start a pandemic. If a virus had a furin cleavage site put into it, it's more likely to start a pandemic. So in a sense, there's a sort of chicken and egg problem here. That we've only got a pandemic because this beastly virus has got such a feature in it. The question is, how did it get it? And I'm afraid, you just can't go on saying, oh yeah, we wanted to put one of these into a virus, but we probably didn't do it. And anyway, I'm sorry you had to find that out from a Freedom of Information request. We should have told you 2 years ago. It's not good enough for scientists to behave like that.
Yeah, we talked about it. We can't tell you if we did it, and we can't show the information that might sort of prove whether or not we did it. So that's not very encouraging.
The excuse in this case is that grant never got funded by the US government. Right, but did that work get funded by the Chinese government, which was funding most of the work, etc.?
Right. Okay. And I mean, obviously, a big part of the mystery here is the behavior of the Chinese government. As I think everyone knows, this is, on the one hand, particularly troubling given the situation that we're in, but also very much sort of just what this government does all the time on every issues every day. And so some people would argue that it's a mistake to say that, well, the fact they're covering this up is evidence of anything particularly suspicious because they always refuse to disclose anything. But, I guess I'd ask, how optimistic are you that, governments around the world will be willing to press harder on this issue? How far are they willing to go to try and force a level of transparency on China? I guess you could say if a global pandemic where millions of people die isn't reason enough, what would be? But on the other hand, as always is the case in these situations, there are other considerations, political considerations, business considerations that governments are taking. How optimistic are you that governments are actually going to, in other countries are actually going to press on this point?
Well, just take the recent case of the tennis player. Western governments, or at least the Western media, has been quite robust on this and has forced something of a slightly ham-fisted attempt by the Chinese authorities to excuse the apparent disappearance of this top tennis player. I'd like to see similar, exasperation expressed in the West at what's happening in the case of some of the obscurity about this pandemic. But of course, when you talk to Western governments, they've got a whole bunch of other interests with respect to China, about trade, about cooperation on climate change and things like that, that mean that there is a reluctance to act without some certainty. But I'm afraid there's a chicken and egg thing here. You won't get the certainty until we put pressure on them to reveal more information. Just a simple thing, like who were the first cases? What were their professions? Where did they live? Were some of them laboratory workers, as some of the US intelligence agencies say they think they were? If so, that's a very important bit of information. Why aren't you sharing it with us? You don't have to. I mean, one of the excuses is, well, we don't want to invade patient confidentiality. Well, I'm sorry, you can do it without giving names. It's perfectly possible to say, this person lived in X district and worked in Y place and had no connection with the market, or did have a connection with the market, had no connection with the lab, or did have a connection with the lab. That kind of information, which is, completely routine when we have an outbreak in the West, and was vital in the case of SARS because it showed a link between food handlers and chefs and people like that, and early cases, has not been forthcoming. And yet we've got millions dead.
So one of the main reasons we wrote our book was to raise public awareness, because when the public demands an investigation, then there will be political action. So without the public saying that, hey, we need to find out where this came from, it's possible that leaders will say, then it's not on our priority list. So we really hope that the book has that kind of impact.
And speaking of hoping to have impact, I'm curious, and I certainly don't want to put either of you on the spot in terms of details, but have you attracted any attention from the Chinese government or people that you believe to be, influenced by the Chinese government to put pressure on you to perhaps not go down this road at all?
I think probably the answer to that is, if I had, I probably wouldn't tell you, because it might become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Sure.
But I think, at one level, the short answer is no. We're still living free lives, etc. But at another level, yes, of course, we're nervous about the reaction that will come.
Yeah, Alina, same.
We're definitely on the radar.
Well, you did write a book, so
yeah. I mean, even before the book, there was already stuff. It's a concern, right? But if someone has to do it, and if nobody does it, then we're just waiting for the next pandemic. And maybe next time it's not China, but everyone around the world seems to be on this unstoppable course of building more bio safety labs, more high biosecurity labs and pathogen labs. China says they're going to build one BSL-4 in every province by 2025. And one of their southern provinces wants to build a BSL-3 in almost every city in that province. Why is this happening? So somebody has to raise public awareness about this and push for an investigation and push for better regulation around global pathogen work.
Yeah, and I think as much as there is a political angle to this, it's not all about assigning blame. It's just about uncovering information that could prevent future disaster, right? I think if there was a nuclear accident, as we've seen in the past, often everyone's nervous about building nuclear power plants. But here, you as you just mentioned, we've had potentially something happen in a lab, and yet you have the government with plans to just sort of proceed with building lots more of these things. So it's it's much more about information that could prevent something. It's forward looking rather than just sort of focusing on assigning blame. That's true.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
Just trying to look at a couple of the other questions here we've got from the audience. I think we've covered most of them.
There's one about whether this could have happened as a result of natural selection as the virus spread among workers in a laboratory. And I think it's worth pointing out that one of the things that Alina discovered very early in the pandemic, and it was the reason that I first came across her work, was that the virus was well adapted to infecting human beings right from the start, and didn't appear to be engaging in the sort of rapid evolution that you would expect right at the start of a pandemic, which SARS did, for example. In other words, it had already figured out how to get inside human cells. And there's lots of other evidence pointing to that, you know, the fit between it and the entry receptor into human cells is pretty good compared with other animals. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that probably there had been infection of human cells or tissues well before November, December 2019. Could that have been among laboratory workers in a sort of pre-symptomatic, asymptomatic way? Possibly. Could it have been inside human airway epithelial cells cultured inside the laboratory, which are human cells after all? Well, that's another possibility. Could it have been in humanized mice, that is to say, mice with human ACE2 receptor genes inserted into them? That's another possibility. Could it have been in villagers in a remote part of southern Yunnan who were living near bat caves, and one of them suddenly took a bus to Wuhan for the first time in his life, or something like that, 1,800 kilometers away? Yes, that's a possibility too. But you can see why that piece of evidence, the natural selection of the virus to be good at infecting human beings might well have happened. There's a phenomenon called passaging or passaging, which is when you, I don't know whether you pronounce it with a French or an English way, but anyway, you put the virus into one kind of cell, you then harvest its daughters from that cell and put them into the same kind of cell. And after doing this 4 or 5 times, you're training the virus in evolutionary terms to be better at infecting that species, as it were. This could explain quite a lot of the features of this virus. It could even explain the furin cleavage site suddenly popping up, although not from nowhere. It's too big an insertion to be a sort of one-off mutation. Okay. Actually, I don't know why I'm talking about this kind of stuff. Alina knows this topic better than I do.
I think the clearest point is that this outbreak did not start in December. Okay, there's no way that the earliest human case was in December 2019. Like, it had to have started like weeks or months ago before that. Some people estimate as early as even like June to September 2019 is when the first human case might have been. But generally, most experts will agree it's within the October-November window. So we've seen recently that a lot of news headlines have said that a patient 0 has been identified, and that it's a woman who's sold shrimp at a seafood market, who only developed symptoms on 11 December 2019. There's no way that this person is the first human case. So the question is, who are the first human cases of COVID-19, and why? If the contact tracing has been done, how can we get that information? If the contact tracing hasn't been done, then why? The world's foremost experts on tracing SARS outbreaks were there in Wuhan when it happened. Like, not just the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but even their collaborator from Singapore was there visiting in January. They had every expert within reach to help them trace this outbreak. So why didn't they do the extremely basic steps of contact tracing the earliest cases? Why didn't they test the farms that supplied animals to the seafood market? Instead, they just shut them down without testing. And frankly, they should have looked in the lab and shared all of their information with collaborators as soon as possible to clear any guilt. Because now it's been 2 years. So anything they share is now under this huge shade of suspicion that they might have been tampered with.
Right. So, but just to clarify, so when you talk about, I'd seen this story about the so-called identification of patient 0, which you say is not possible. Are you saying it's not possible what is the evidence that makes it not possible that that be patient zero?
So both genetically and by case data, it's not possible. So genetically, we know that there were earlier variants, earlier lineages of this virus that never passed through the market. So all of the sequences from the market, whether it's from humans or from the surfaces in the market, because no animal samples that were ever positive for SARS-2, all of these sequences belong to a later lineage of the virus. So it must have started before the market. And people estimate from the genetics that it should have been October, November when it started. The case data also doesn't make sense, because if you look at some of the earliest studies that were published before this issue got so politicized, they say the earliest case developed symptoms on the 1st of December. And actually a large portion of the first cases they had identified had no links to the market. But soon after that, the hospitals that started this criteria of identifying cases where they looked for links to market. So they specifically looked at people who had visited the market and looked for cases there. So that's why when we look at the December cases now, it looks like a lot of them are from the market. It's because there had been ascertainment bias.
Okay. Oh, I understand. That makes sense. We're just about out of time here. I've got, here's one last question. I think I know the answer to it, but would buying this book and posting about it all over social media and sharing this video on social media, would this, do you think, help spread the message?
Yes.
Yes.
As Anita said, the reason we wrote this book is because we think this is a really important topic. We want to get to the bottom of it. We want to help the world get to the bottom of it. We want the truth to come out. We don't care if the truth turns out to be different from what we think it is. We're trying to help the reader make up their own mind about what happened. And the more people can get hold of this book and read it and join in the conversation, the better. We're in the business of getting rid of all this secrecy and having a proper, transparent conversation about a really important topic. This isn't us trying to seek fame or fortune. This is us trying to we spent a year writing what we hope is the best account of what happened. And that was, it was a labor of love.
Yeah, I wanted to add that we are donating half of our earnings to charity. And the money is not life-changing, although it's nice. So thank you, HarperCollins. I'd say the book for me has more value in terms of getting the message out. So the thing that has been most gratifying for me is hearing from other scientists who have read the book, and they said, wow, this is extremely factual. Actually, 15% of the book is citations. So readers can go and fact check everything and find the sources of every single statement we make in the book. And yeah, just buy this book and give it to your favorite scientist or relative who insists that this virus might have come from a market. Like, send it to them. Like, just let them inform themselves.
Well, I think it's very apropos that a book that demands transparency itself has lots of citations to back up what it claims. And I really do want to commend you both. We're obviously the think tank at the MLI. We like to delve into ideas that we think are important, that we think sometimes do not get enough attention. So we certainly see eye to eye on that. And I just want to thank you very much for joining us today and talking about your book. And thanks very much to our audience for joining in. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you.